Welcome to Season 3 of the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Last year, host Jorden Guth got a crash course in the fundamentals of hi-fi from enthusiasts, journalists, manufacturers, and music industry professionals alike. And those lessons will continue, but this year, Jorden will also get a history lesson from the legends who were there from the giddy up and who made hi-fi what it is today. So with that out of the way, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Today we have Paul Hales joining us, the CEO and product designer of Pro Audio Technology as well as Theory Audio Design. Paul has a really extensive history in the audio industry, both in consumer audio as well as the professional audio space. So really interesting conversation about to happen. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Jorden. Glad to be here.
So a couple weeks ago, we met for the first time. We were in your experience center and we were talking about the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. You were listening to some of the episodes that we had with Dr. Floyd Toole and some of the other folks. And you made a joke that there's audio professionals outside of Canada. And it was the lighthearted way of saying that, like, there is a lot that you were talking about in Canada, but there's more outside of that. That kind of had me thinking of this idea that a lot of the research that Dr. Floyd Toole did at NRC and the other folks as well, of course, has made its way outside. So I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you were impacted by that and how that's led to your own research and a whole bunch of other stuff. Let's get started with how you got into audio originally. Like, what is your origin story? When did you first kind of find audio?
Yeah. So, wow, that goes way back. So I became, I don't know if audiophile is the correct term, but audio enthusiast when I was 12 years old, literally. And part of that was influence from my father. So in the 50s and 60s, he had dabbled in hi-fi, built Heath kits and built speaker enclosures and bolted JBL components into them and stuff. And so when I was in middle school, I had this shelf top stereo all-in-one unit, which you're probably too young, Jorden, to have ever had one of these. But, there was a box that had a AM/FM tuner on the front and a turntable built into the top surface.
Wow.
And sometimes they had, I think mine had a 8-track player in the front too, right? And so that was my hi-fi that my dad had bought at a garage sale and refurbished and gave to me. And it broke. And he was having built Heath kits and a kind of a self-starter guy. He fixed his cars and did all this work himself and stuff. Normally he could repair these things. And this one died in a way that he couldn't fix. And so I was also at the time dabbling with drumming a little bit. So my folks had bought me this Ludwig drum set. And so I had the drum set in my bedroom and I had the hi-fi in my bedroom and the hi-fi broke. And my dad said, why don't you sell that dumb drum set and buy a real stereo? And I think he was motivated probably for two reasons. One is he wanted me to get a real stereo, number one, because I think he wanted to enjoy it too. But the second motivation is I think I was driving my parents crazy playing the drums in my bedroom, right?
I love it.
So he helped me out. He got me a job. I was at 12, I was washing windows for a few restaurants in the town that I grew up in. And so I would go every couple of weeks and wash the inside and outside of the restaurant's windows. And I'd get paid like $10-12 or whatever each time. And so at 12 years old in 1977, that was like a pretty good gig, right? So I was able to save a little of my own money. I sold the drum set and scratched together, believe it or not, $600. Wow. And so for 1977, that got you a pretty nice rig, right? So I was, I guess, 6th grade, maybe 7th grade. Went out to Pacific Stereo back when there was stereo stores, right? And we went into the speaker room and pressed the buttons and listened to the different speakers and ended up buying this big, sort of chunky walnut wrapped Pioneer receiver, big, beautiful weighted knobs on the front, and Pioneer direct drive turntable. You had to have direct drive, of course, and a pair of speakers, 12-inch three-ways. They were pretty high output, pretty big speaker, high value, and took this thing home. And then I've been hooked ever since, essentially.
So from 12 years old and then onwards, you effectively were so hooked that in school, part of your choices to what to take was based on audio.
That's right. So
post-secondary school.
That's right. So, but even in high school, I mean, like audio hobbyists do, right? We like to upgrade. So I had been selling my cassette player to my buddy so I could buy the fancier one and all that stuff. And so I kept changing components in the system. But in the middle of high school, I was probably 16. So I was young for my grade, so I graduated at 17. So probably a junior in high school. I'm old for my age now somehow, but I was young for my grade then. But I wanted to upgrade the speakers. I had done a lot of the electronic part, and I got particularly interested in the loudspeakers. And so I went shopping and didn't really find anything that excited me very much. But at the time, there was a company in Seattle called Speaker Lab that sold speaker kits and speaker components and crossover parts and things like that. And so I got hold of the catalog and studied that thing. And I decided to build my own speakers when I was 16. So I copied, but I'll say I was inspired by one of their kits, right? And they had this big ambitious kit. It was their flagship model. It was a 5-way speaker. It was a 4-way speaker. It was a 5-driver 4-way speaker. So it was a very ambitious speaker at the time. And rather than buy the kit, I could save money by doing it myself, right? So I could buy the components separately, build the enclosure myself, and design the crossover from components. And so that's what I did. And then I took wood shop in high school for the specific purpose of building those enclosures, right? Like I didn't want to take the class. I just wanted the speaker boxes, right? So I took the class. I built the speaker boxes. I designed the speaker, and they turned out way better than they had any business turning out, because a 4-way speaker is hard for anybody, right? But I think I was lucky, and I think that when they designed their kit, I think they probably factored this in. But the sensitivity of the different drivers and the different ways were all pretty well matched. So I could use the formulas to make simple crossovers. They were probably second order crossovers, second order Butterworth crossovers. And the final result was actually pretty balanced, pretty accurate sounding speaker. And they were big. They were impressive. They were almost 5 feet tall, or about 5 feet tall. A 12-inch woofer, a 10-inch woofer, a 6.5-inch mid bass, a 1.5-inch dome upper mid range, and then a planar magnetic tweeter. And so that was super fun for me. And the results turned out good. And so, that's about the time you try to decide what you're going to do if you go to college, right? So we're all trying to figure out, you're applying for college as a junior, trying to figure out what you're going to do with your life. And I just kind of decided that this is what I like the most. And so I designed my college education around wanting to get into the speaker business.
At that point, was your dad excited that you got rid of those drums, or was he like, now I need more drums to get you out of the intensity that you have with speakers?
Yeah. So they just traded one cacophony for a different one, right? So they, those speakers could play quite loud. I mean, that's a lot. I
was going to say,
yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of horsepower. And interestingly enough, I was super into Rush, right? Like my first concert that I went to was the 2112 tour. So that's a very Canadian thing to do, right? And so, yes, I played music that they didn't always approve of, including Kiss. When you're 12, 14-year-old in 1970s, you had to be into Kiss, right? So I think he just traded one, problem for a different one. But you couldn't argue with how it turned out. And because he was a guy that liked to do stuff himself, like, restore cars and, do projects himself, he appreciated the putting a lot of work into something and seeing the results of it. Right. So the combination of me being into music and sound and speakers specifically, combined with, I just love inventing stuff and creating stuff and building things, right? So those two things went together perfectly, right? And so I pursued a career in it.
And when you did end up going to university or college, it was for mechanical engineering, I think.
That's right. Yeah. So originally I intended to study electrical engineering. I couldn't decide which one of those two was the most applicable to loudspeakers. It turns out they both are, right? The loudspeakers are fundamentally mechanical devices, right? They're electroacoustic transducers. There's a little bit of electrical engineering in the crossover networks and things like that. But the way it worked out, I went to the University of California at Davis, and just the way the curriculum worked out and all that stuff, I ended up a mechanical engineering student. But then I tailored my coursework around the stuff that would apply most to loudspeakers. So it was things like thermodynamics, material science. I spent a lot of time, because this is at a time when, metal dome tweeters were a new thing, right? And the idea of using different materials for the transducer diaphragm was kind of new and exciting. And in fact, my senior project in my material science class was selecting the best material for a loudspeaker diaphragm. And the answer at the time was beryllium. Not surprisingly, right?
Still used today in some applications.
That's right. There's a lot of the best, a lot of the best drivers are in fact beryllium. I mean, ceramic is also up there and stuff, but the whole study was what properties do you need to give the best performance? And the other metals were in there, titanium and aluminum and stuff, but the beryllium rose to the top. And I think that's why the audio industry eventually figured out how to make them out of beryllium. Took decades to figure out how to do it in a mass production sort of way. But so that's what I did. And then, the pattern repeated in college, because my senior mechanical engineering project at UC Davis was designing the very first speaker that my business that I founded after college sold. So I used the anechoic chamber at the university to spin up what eventually turned into my first commercial product.
Now, in the first business, was this Hales?
Yes. So Hales Design Group, 1988. And I think we introduced the first commercial model either in 89 or 90. I don't recall. It probably was 90. And yeah, so that's going back a number of years, 35 years.
I know it well. That was the year I was born.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, now I definitely feel old. All right.
Sorry to do that too.
That's all right.
But I'm just thinking about what's happening in that time. So a lot of the research at the NRC is being conducted at that time. It's kind of ongoing. The major stuff isn't out quite yet. At that time, aside from university and school, was there papers? Was there research that you were actively investigating or kind of looking at and saying oh, these are some good concepts from which I could use to kind of develop my speakers?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and the answer might surprise you. So, I was unaware of what was happening at the NRC. I hadn't heard the name Floyd Toole. I had kind of the books that speaker hobbyists had at the time. I had Vance Dickinson's Loudspeaker Design Cookbook, which I think was, at the time, it was probably like a little pamphlet kind of thing. And I had a couple other textbooks on the topic. And I had some crude equipment. There wasn't really, at least in 88, I didn't have access to any kind of digital measurement system or anything. I just had a third octave analyzer. But what I did have was I worked during college in the summers. I worked for the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which is the big utility company in Northern California. And I worked at the Department of Engineering Research, a lab in the East Bay area. And I worked in the geotechnical group. So we were soils and rocks and dams and stuff like that. But they had an acoustics group that could do sound measurements. And they had a whole bunch of Brüel and Kjær, the green, old-fashioned Brüel and Kjær equipment. And so a friend of mine worked in that group, and she was able to convince the manager to let us lug, that very expensive Brüel and Kjær equipment up to UC Davis, put it in the anechoic chamber and do my measurements. And so I was really just going off, what I had learned from the speaker lab catalog, and formulas, the loudspeaker design cookbook. It really, Vance wrote it that way. It was kind of like, here's what matters in a speaker. And so that's where I started. And even though when I came out of the university, I was an engineer and I had an engineering, I am very technically competent. That doesn't immediately mean that guarantee that you can design a good speaker, right? Like I knew the principles and I knew the concepts, but that's not the only thing you need. It's not the only thing in the formula for making a good speaker. And so I spent the next couple of years kind of tweaking the speaker, largely by ear. I would measure it, but a third octave analyzer doesn't give you a lot of information. I'm not aware of what Floyd and those guys are doing in Canada. And so I ended up with a pretty good product, but it was through, tenacity. It wasn't through, genius. I wasn't one of the better loudspeaker designers in the world. I just didn't stop until I thought it sounded compelling. And so fortunately, when we introduced the speaker, a whole bunch of other people thought it sounded compelling too. And so we were successful. So I didn't become aware, this is going to sound a little embarrassing, but I didn't become aware of Floyd Toole and what was going on until the late 90s, when he had been at Harman for a while. And there's a couple of funny stories about that. Without going into too much detail, one of the brands within the Harman Group, the guy that founded it, called me up, and he was a guy that I had met, and we'd done a project together for Samsung earlier in the decade. And he called me up and said, "Hey, Paul, I want to buy a pair of your speakers." And I thought, well, that's really weird. That's like me calling up another speaker company, say, "Hey, accommodate me on one of your speakers," right? And because I liked him so much, and because I knew he's going to go buy him retail anyway, right? I accommodated him. I sold Harman a pair of Hales speakers in like 97 or 98 at half off retail. They got the industry accommodation and all that. And then about a year later or so, I was interviewing a candidate for an engineering position at Hales. I had been the only engineer for the whole time. And I finally got to the point where I was like, I could probably use some help here. And right at the end of the interview, the guy had come from Infinity. So he worked within Infinity inside of Harman. And he ran out. He goes, hold on. He ran out to his car and he came back in waving these papers around. And it was a bunch of Melissa plots. So Melissa was the sort of go-to measurement system of the 90s, right? In fact, I think John Atkinson still uses it to this day for his stereophile measurements. But it was a very good digital analyzer that a company of my size could afford, and everybody was using it. And he brings this in, and the engineer shows it to me, and I look at it and I was like, oh, that's a good speaker. What is that? And at the bottom it says Hales Revelation 3. And
the ones that you sold him years ago. That's amazing.
Exactly. And what he actually showed me that I didn't realize at the time was spinorama. Okay. So it had the on-axis, the listening window, and it had the DI curves on there. I didn't know that's what they were, but that's what they were. So this is late 90s, and I still hadn't discovered that officially. That was my first introduction to it. And then, as I moved along, I became a member of the Audio Engineering Society very early on, probably in 92 or 93 or something like that. So I had access to those papers, and I would go to the conventions all the time, but I still didn't discover sort of what Floyd had been doing until much later, sort of after I had already done it myself. So while they had it largely figured out and had been doing all the work in Canada, and I was surprised from the podcast when you spoke with him to learn that he had learned a lot of it in the 80s. Yeah. So that's before I didn't realize they had it figured out so early. But it makes a lot of sense to me now, because I think I shared this with you when you visited. In the 90s, the speakers I made were high-end audio speakers, and so they were on the expensive side, right? And so my friends who didn't want to spend $2,000 for a pair of speakers or $1,000 even for a pair of speakers, they would say, what should I buy? And I didn't pay much attention to the sort of more mid-fi end of the market, except that I knew that I always liked the sound coming out of Paradigm speakers. And so I would recommend Paradigm. I didn't know why, but I would just say Paradigm is a good bet because they always sounded accurate to me. And now I know why. Because they were
already influenced by that research.
Exactly. They had that stuff already, and it makes perfect sense to me. And so while they were already enjoying the benefit of all the research that was done there, I was doing it the hard way in Huntington Beach, California, where I would run from my lab, which is at one end of the building, down to the listening room, which was at the opposite end of the building. Listen, tweak the crossover, listen again, then carry the speaker back to the lab and then measure it. And I was trying to correlate the measured performance with sound quality, right? But I did it the hard way. I did it empirically over thousands of hours. And by about 96 or 97, I had figured it out. Yeah. And so that Revelation 3 speaker that Harman bought, that was a particularly that one benefited the most from what I had learned. And I set out with two objectives for that whole series of product. One was the best performance possible, but the best value possible. I wasn't going to spend a fortune on exotic capacitors and stuff like that contributed very little to the overall performance. I wanted to spend the money where it made a difference, and I wanted to build the most accurate speaker I could. And, I would put that speaker up against any speaker today. I mean, if you Google it, if you look at the Stereophile review, which you can find online on their website, look at the measured performance. It's a very flat, very accurate loudspeaker. And that was designed in 97. So, but I did it on my own. I didn't do it with the benefit of the research that Floyd had done. And I regret that because it could have saved me so much time. But, look, I have the satisfaction of knowing I figured it out on my own, right? And then, Floyd did it obviously with much higher level of precision and more scientific method. I was doing it in a commercial sense, right? I was trying to make a speaker that would be commercially successful. They were doing genuine research and data and blind listening and all that stuff. And it's kind of funny because when Stereophile published the review of the Revelation 3, they did an interview with me, a feature story, and they interviewed me. And one of the questions was, do you do blind listening? And I was like, no, we don't do any blind listening. Sometimes it's so late at night. We've been doing it so long, I'm blind. but we're just listening. We're doing it all the wrong ways. And then later on, I was able to connect the dots more sort of after my stint at QSC, to believe it or not.
So, and actually, you just mentioned something there, and we should kind of frame that. So up until this point, you were doing consumer speakers. Mm-hmm. What changed and what happened to have you kind of push more into the pro audio space? Yeah.
So I had kind of gotten disillusioned with the sort of consumer audio and specifically the audiophile part of the consumer market by about 97 or 98 or so. And for a couple of reasons. One, the business, there's a lot of snake oil and misinformation and nonsense that goes on in that end of the world. But the other thing was I had realized that the dynamic qualities of those systems just doesn't cut it, right? And so a couple things kind of brought that to my attention. One is we would go to movies a lot, and we were very fortunate. There's a big megaplex here in Irvine where we live that has, they spent a lot of money on audio. So like, for example, in the larger rooms, the side speakers were 15-inch JBL two-ways. A whole bunch of
massive.
Yes. They spent a ton of money on audio. And I would go watch a movie and hear this huge sound, big, dynamic, bold, powerful sound. And then I'd go back and listen to my hi-fi and go, wait a minute, something's wrong here. And then I think I shared this story with you guys too when you visited. I had a genuine epiphany when my first daughter was born in 95. And we live about 30 minutes from Disneyland. And so when our kids were small, we had annual passes. We'd take them to Disneyland all the time. And at Disneyland, particularly back then, you could just hear a lot of unamplified live music, right? So they had a cappella singers, they had barbershop quartets, they had jazz bands, they had marching bands, they had all of these places where you could go hear live music without sound reinforcement. And I was there one day, and I was waiting. My wife was off doing something, and I had my daughter in this little backpack. She was probably 2.5 or 3 years old, probably 2.5. And she could stand in this backpack behind me, and we were standing there, and we happened across this guy playing a tenor saxophone. It was just one man and one instrument, and he had the benefit of standing in front of this big building, so he had the energy was reflecting off the building. But I just remember standing there with my daughter, going, "Oh my God, that sound is so big and so powerful and so loud and so effortless." And then I just realized, what we're doing in consumer audio just isn't even remotely close to that dynamically. Now, we could get the timbre right. Like my speakers had accurate timbre, but they couldn't reproduce the scale, the dynamic scale of a real saxophone. And so that led me in 98 off on a pursuit of dynamics. And so this is about the same time that surround sound, I think we had laser discs, right?
Love it.
And it might have been early DVD. I don't remember, but we definitely had laser discs. And so now this notion of a surround sound system came about, right? And so what all the speaker companies did is they just took one of their models and they turned it over on its side and they called it a center channel. And a lot of times the center channel was the smallest speaker in the line. So you'd have these big left and right speakers and then this little baby center speaker that was just horizontal oriented. And the vast majority of the soundtrack energy comes from the center, right? So it's just the wrong approach. And so I did two things to pursue dynamic range. I designed a speaker called Cinema Reference, which was a 15-inch horn-loaded two-way. I used JBL components, and we showed it at CES in probably 99, I would guess. And then I in the Revelation series, so that speaker that I had sold to Harman, it topped out at Revelation 3. I designed a Revelation 5, and Revelation 5 specifically. My goal with that was to preserve everything we had, but increase the dynamic range. And so I worked with Audax, which was a big manufacturer of the loudspeaker components at the time. And we developed a 5-inch mid-range that had 93.5 dB sensitivity, which is up there. Right?
Quite powerful, yeah.
Especially for a small mid-range like that. And then I used 2 high-efficiency 8-inch woofers. And then they had a dome tweeter that was horn-loaded. It had this real shallow horn, and it had 93 dB sensitivity too. So I was able to achieve a system sensitivity of that model of 93. And the dynamics and scale were much bigger. Now, they couldn't compete with the 15-inch horn speaker, but it was remarkably better at producing at the big scale of a movie soundtrack. And so those two things happened right before I got the invitation to join QSC. And so QSC was a no-brainer at the time. It was, then I could design speakers for commercial cinema, right? And that was the motivation to go spend some time on the professional side.
In QSC, I don't even know what the acronym stands for, but they are not in the consumer space at all.
No, QSC is Quilter Sound Company. The founder, one of the founders is Pat Quilter. They were at the time. They were they were a manufacturer of professional power amplifiers, and they owned the majority of the commercial cinema business. So if you went to a movie around 2000, they had something like 85% of the commercial cinema power amp business. JBL owned the speaker part, and QSC owned the amplifier part, and they had wanted to get into the loudspeaker business, tried to acquire a couple companies, and those weren't successful. And so they actually what happened is the CEO happened to read my interview in stereo file And he kind of concluded this kid kind of sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And they took a risk and hired an audiophile to design speakers for professional applications, which was both the dumbest thing he could have done and the smartest thing he could have done, because it was dumb because, you know, I'm an audiophile guy, right? And I don't know first thing about professional loudspeakers. But it was smart because I didn't know the first thing about professional loudspeakers, right? So I brought in...
Come in with a clean slate.
Oh, entirely different thinking, right? And so for the first couple of years I was there, I would be saying stuff and people just looked at me like, are you nuts? Like, where are you from? Like, did you come from Mars? Like, what are you talking about, right? And it wasn't too long before I got the nickname Audio Princess. So
there you go.
Yeah.
That's good. That suits you well. I like it.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely caring about a lot of stuff they thought I was crazy to care about. But it ended up being a nice 4 years, and I learned a lot, and I think they benefited a lot. And then we went our separate ways. And now we're kind of back in the same market segments again with theory. But
so I know kind of the next question I'm going to ask you, but just before I do that, let's take a short break for everyone that's listening. And when we get back, we'll kind of pick up where we left off, which is what you were learning in the kind of commercial space, and then how that kind of brought you more along the path to where you are now. So,
okay,
let's just take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. We are still with Paul Hales, and we ended our pre-break discussion about how you kind of joined QSC and that journey into more of the commercial audio space. And I want to start off with, I want you to retell a story that you shared with me a few weeks back, where you were just fairly new at QSC and you were brought in to do audio at a racetrack, and you were up against some different folks that were already well-established players in the game, and what you brought to your proposal and how that kind of worked out.
Yeah, no, that was a fun memory from QSC, actually. So in about 2001, probably, I'd been there about a year. We learned that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was doing a shootout because they wanted to upgrade their audio system. They had a paging system that the announcer spoke through. But anybody who's been to that race knows that it's really just a 3-day long party, right? They kind of start partying early Friday morning, and they kind of don't stop until early Monday morning. And so they would, when they tried to play music through these paging horns, it sounded, admittedly terrible, right? And so some of the other brands had already had kind of a head start. They had known about it for, I think, almost a year. We found out about it, I want to say in February, and the shootout was in May. And so what they did is they gave each manufacturer that wanted to participate in, compete to get selected for the new system. They gave us a couple 100 feet of racetrack. So we happened to be right on the yard of bricks. So we were right at the start finish line. And then the other brands were around the, different areas of the track. And we all fielded systems, that would, we'd use to compete against one another in this, evaluation. And we didn't even really have commercial products yet. So I had only been there a year. We were still figuring it out. And we had a couple of boxes that had been made available to us from kind of a partner, another company that kind of partnered with QSC for a short period of time. And so I just grabbed what I had, and I did what I did my thing, right? And so what I did is I designed a hi-fi system. So we went there and we set up in our little section, and then I don't want to mention the other brands, but they're all the brands that today. They're the big names in professional loudspeakers, and I think there's 6 total different brands, and and then they kind of started, the track had some audio gurus on staff. And then I think they had a couple consultants, and then they had management, and they were walking from, brand to brand to brand, and letting us do our demo. And the first two companies went, and one of them was this giant system in the middle of the infield. They were trying to throw the sound all the way across the track into the bleachers, which was ridiculous. And it was kind of funny because we're like, that's never going to work. And when we were waiting and we could hear their demo, we heard, and every once in a while it goes, and the high frequencies were blowing down to our section, right? So we knew that their bleachers weren't getting the high frequencies because they were literally blowing down to where we were, a mile away. So anyway, that's an aside. So they finally make it over to us. We put on our music, and we used all kinds of different content, but we used Metallica, and I just made this 200-foot wide hi-fi system. It sounded amazing. Yeah. And so they're sitting there scratching their chins and stuff, and trying to figure out what it is they're hearing. That's one of the things I noticed when I was at QSC is I could make these big, ugly PA speakers sound like a hi-fi speaker. And it moved their cheese to such a degree that they would get perplexed. They're like, what is happening right now? Like, why does that sound coming out of that box sound like that? And that's kind of what happened at this shootout. And so at one point, I was there with the touring marketing manager, the live sound marketing manager, and the audio guru from the track came over, and he leans over to Brian and he goes, "Who aligned this system?" And Brian goes, "He did." And he points to me, and I leaned in. I was like, what did I do? What does aligned mean? Like, I didn't even know the terminology they were using, right? But what he meant was the delays. We had the main system on the fence, and the delays were time aligned to the thing. And he was marveling at how good it was. And, he said, "Who did it?" And Brian goes, "Paul did." And I was like, what does that mean? Like, what did I do? But I just did what I knew to do, which was to make the best sounding speaker I could. And we fielded this 200-foot wide hi-fi, and we won the shootout.
So when you first mentioned this or told me the story, the first thing I thought of was, I remember going through schools or going in, let's say, a county fair or a racetrack or whatever it may be, outside experiences or indoor experiences. And I have never thought about the PA system as anything other than like a muffled, terrible sounding speaker. So why is it, if you have an opinion, like, why is it that no one has ever cared about it? Or what is it that people just don't seem to kind of consider a higher fidelity commercial application?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's one of my longtime frustrations. I mean, it's good in the sense that we can be more competitive, but the answer is, there's a couple different aspects to the answer. So one is adaptation, and I don't mean the acoustic adapting to a room that you're in, but I mean adapting to the systems you're used to, right? And so I think one of the problems we have in audio is PAs have kind of always sounded like that. They always expect them to sound like that, and they design them to sound like that because they don't know not to, right? Yeah. That's the benefit I had, is I was a hi-fi guy. I'm like, I don't want it to sound like that. I want it to sound like a hi-fi. And so I got some big, ugly boxes that had no business sounding like a hi-fi to sound like a hi-fi. And so that's part of it, is it's just accepted. This is, we care about SPL. We care about hitting the listener's ears that we care about. We want to keep the sound off the walls, blah, blah, blah. Right. And so, especially back then, there were just a lot of bad horns. Right. Mm-hmm. So, what we know, and what, Floyd's work and the others that worked at the NRC, what we know is that the reverberant sound matters too. It doesn't matter as much as the direct sound, but the reflected sound matters. And that's what in CEA 2034, that's what the, predicted room reflections curve does. And then it translates almost verbatim to the predicted in-room response. And so if you have these big high Q boxes in the pro world, especially back then, SPL was king. You had to play loud enough, and then they obsessed over pattern control so that you aim the sound where you want it to go. And in doing that, you sacrifice the off-axis response and you create, that sort of classic cupped hands horn sound. And that just became, I think, accepted because in order to get the SPL they needed or whatever, that's the price you paid. Well, guess what? The system that we fielded at the racetrack was 180 degree wide horn. It was a diffraction slot, and it was a very broad dispersion. We weren't firing it into this high Q device that colored the sound. And so I started to realize what made good horns good and what made bad horns bad. And I was able to identify good ones and design good ones because I was thinking about it from a hi-fi perspective and not the last guy that designed the 40 by 60 horn. He's going to design another one just like it. And I was like, I don't want it to be like that because that doesn't sound good. How can we, accomplish the SPL we need without getting the horn coloration? And so that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years is I can make horn speakers sound good. They don't sound like horn speakers. And so, I've lost the question at this point, but I think, can you repeat the question?
Well, and I think you kind of answered it. And it's this idea of like, why was it that commercial audio just never kind of, I'm going to say cared, but I don't even know if cared is the right word. They never kind of considered the overall sound quality as something as important as just loudness, let's say.
Right. Yeah. So, and part of it, it's not their fault so much. Part of it was achieving the SPLs that you need to achieve. Like if you have a big outdoor festival or something, you got to play loud, right? And so part of it isn't their fault, but the other part of it is that adaptation I'm talking about, right? And so the consumer guys are guilty of it too, because
in another way.
Yes, the consumer products are dynamically wrong. They don't do dynamics right, but nobody seems to realize, because guess what? That's what they've always been like, and so they design the next one like the last one. And so I did an interview recently where I kind of pointed that out. Is after that epiphany that I had with the saxophone player, I stopped comparing speakers to other speakers, and I stopped comparing, both our speaker against the competitor speaker, but also our speaker against the last speaker we made, right? And I started instead comparing it to what real sound is like. And so at QSE, I bought a drum kit, a saxophone, and there's a third instrument I'm spacing out here. I don't remember what it was. And I bought this like digital recording console so that we could play the instruments, record them in that room, and then play the recording back over the speaker and compare it to the real poorly played saxophone, right? And so I think the industry is guilty of not. I hate to use this cliche, but not thinking outside the box. They're just all copying each other, and they're doing what they've always done, right? And so, when the new flagship model comes out, they compare it to the old flagship model they had, and it's incrementally better. Therefore, it's fine, right? That's why, in my opinion, neither the professional sort of sound reinforcement products or the consumer hi-fi products have evolved all that much. They sound largely like they sounded 30 years ago.
The way that I like to think about it as you're kind of giving your examples is people are playing in their own sandboxes, and there's no cross-pollination between those sandboxes, between some of the kind of stuff that's being done in commercial versus consumer. I guess my next line of question here is, this was you getting really well versed in the commercial speakers. Is this what led you to kind of, because it was mid 2000s or 2010 where you started Pro Audio Technologies?
2004. Yeah.
2004?
So that's exactly what that was. So what happened was I think I mentioned earlier, I had designed a speaker called Cinema Reference in like 98, which was a 15-inch horn-loaded professional style speaker for the Hales brand. When we went to CES that year, we had two rooms. We had our hi-fi room and we had a second room where we had surround sound. And Apollo 13 had just come out on Laserdisc or whatever. And so we were able to make this rocket launch scene from Apollo 13 sound like a real rocket launch. And all of the dealers that we had been doing business with that went to CES looked at me. They looked at me like the people at QSC looked at me like, are you nuts? Like, what's wrong with you? You can't use a horn. Like, what's the matter with 15-inch two-way? You can't have a 15-inch two-way. And I'm like, do you not hear the scale and realism that this is doing? And so we had 5 of those. Was 5.2 and then two 18-inch subwoofers. And there was one dealer that did understand it. And he is a former actor that's been in hi-fi, and he sells screening rooms to movie stars and to movie industry people. And so while I was at QSC, he called me up. He had sold a number of Cinema Reference speakers to movie stars, actually, and one very famous female singer. And he called me up. He said, "Paul, nobody makes anything like Cinema Reference. Like you got to get these for me. I need these. I can't find anything that will do what those were doing." And so I said, "Okay." And I went to ownership and management at QSC. I said, "Hey, you guys interested in this? Do you want to do this?" And they said, "No, we looked at residential and we're not interested in residential." And so I asked him. I said, "Well, do you mind if I do it?" And they're like, "No, fine, go ahead." And so I partnered with the OEM that actually still makes Pro speakers to this day in 2000, probably 2 or 3, probably 3, I would guess. And I built some speakers for Joe to sell to movie stars. And I would make a fortune in a weekend. And I'm like, maybe there's something to this. and so what had happened is the sort of CDO world, the home theater dealers, bringing DSP and horns and stuff to the consumer space in 98, it was premature. They didn't know how to wrap their heads around it, but it had evolved. The CDA world had evolved enough by 2004 that I felt like, okay, they're probably ready for this now. And so I left QSC and started Pro Audio. It was called Professional Home Cinema. That's the name of the business, Professional Home Cinema LLC. We changed our name in 2010, and I can explain why we did that because we're just now really leveraging it. But and so I went off to sort of marry my two lives. It worked at the Indy Motor Speedway because I made professional speaker. I made a 200-foot wide, loud hi-fi, and so that's what I did. Is I founded Pro to make, let's say, very accurate hi-fi systems for reproducing movie soundtracks. That might be a way to say it.
Gotcha. So you're taking the experiences and the knowledge that you learned from the commercial space, as well as your previous history in the consumer space, marrying those together. And the original intention was home theater systems.
That's right. That's right.
And this obviously snowballs again, as everything seems to. And you started looking more towards the commercial space first, and I'm talking like restaurants in that space, or did you start going more to the consumer space more in depth?
Yeah. So Pro, from 2004 through, let's say, 2015 or so, it was primarily focused on what we call private screening rooms, right? So they're almost always in residential buildings, but not always. Like we sold a number of systems to movie studios that needed screening rooms, and to even some of the actors and directors and stuff would have a commercial space, and we'd sell the systems for that. But it was primary commercial, very, very high-end home theater, essentially, right? But one of the things that I enjoyed the most at QSC was making products for sort of the commercial spaces that we frequent regularly, like retail stores, restaurants, bars, hotels, spas, airports, convention centers, the commercial spaces we're in on a daily basis. And so that prompted me in 2018, I guess, to start a second business, Theory Audio Design, to develop speakers not only for those kinds of spaces, but that could also be used in the smaller spaces in houses, right? So Pro would be their go-to brand for the dealers when they got a dedicated screening room, right?
Gotcha.
So they would reach for Pro, and then there'd be 8 other TVs around the house with some other smaller speakers all connected everywhere. And so it was kind of a 2-pronged strategy. One was to sell some speakers to commercial spaces, but also into the rest of the house, in the media rooms, game rooms, master bedrooms, family rooms, things like that.
Okay. Tying some of these pieces together, when we're talking about these are technically somewhat different applications. What is it? Like, is there similarities here that just matter across all audio, regardless of application? Or is there things that, like, no, they're very specific to this speaker in this setup? Like, is there universal truths of like good quality sound?
Yes, there is. And bless you for asking that question. So look, I'm going to say something that probably nobody is going to agree with me on. And that is essentially that if you can do the dynamic range and the bandwidth that the application requires, a good speaker is a good speaker is a good speaker, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's a live sound application, a commercial background music application, a hi-fi application, or a home theater application. What we know is that accuracy is what matters. And that's what I did at QSC at the beginning, and people scratched their heads like, what's happening? And I made accurate speakers, but I made them I made professional speakers that were accurate. And that's how we won the shootout, right? And so, that idea that regardless of application and regardless of listener experience, it doesn't matter whether it's an audiophile, a trained listener, an average person, a little kid, everyone tends to prefer accurate sound. So when the instruments sound like we know them to sound, we're around instruments enough to know, or we know what human voice sounds like, and we're able to hear colorations, even if you're not maybe an audio enthusiast or whatever. And so that basic rule applies everywhere. And I think that, again, it's kind of adaptation that the companies that are we make big PA speakers for concerts, right? I think that they have made them the way they've made them so long that they've just grown accustomed to them being that way, right? Like, it's very rare to hear a big PA system not have clean, clear mid bass and delicate, open high end and stuff. They just don't. They have congested, muddled, aggressive sound with not much top end in it. And it's only because that's the way they've always done it. And they don't, I don't think it occurs to them that it doesn't have to be like that, right?
They're trying to hit the spec for something like SPL or whatever it may be, but they might be missing all these other elements that would typically require or lend to a good sound.
Yeah, I think that what they're doing is they're making design choices that address their priority list, which is real. I mean, they do need to get the sound to the right places. They need to, if the audience is here, and they need to get the sound to the audience. And it's a challenge because it could be a long ways. The person in the back is far away and the person in the front is close. And so that's why you see these line arrays, right? Yeah. Everybody has a line array. And then this idea of sort of high Q, where you have horns which control the sound in an aggressive way. They kind of try to point the sound. Those two design choices have caused them to accept the sound quality that they get, rather than to try to hit both of those objectives, but increase the clarity and accuracy of the sound. And I think it's because they, number one, probably don't know how, and number two, they don't know why they would want that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, that's what happened at Indy. Is it's kind of like the first speaker I showed at CES is like, I didn't get caught up in any kind of loudspeaker design dogma or like these are the rules, I have to follow the rules. I just designed the speaker that sounded the best and was most compelling and didn't care about the rules. And that's kind of how I do it now. Like, if you look at the Theory products, they're different than most of the products in the same category. And I don't care that you're not supposed to do that, right? Like, it's like, oh, you can't do that. You have to do this. This is the way the industry does it. The problem with that thinking is that guarantees that the industry is never going to evolve, number one, but it also is particularly problematic in this industry because a lot of that stuff is wrong, right? A lot of that stuff isn't the best way to do it. It's just the way that people have thought they needed to do it, or it's the accepted way of doing it. And so they adhere to rules that perhaps shouldn't be there, I guess is a way to say it.
Let me just kind of think of the flip side of this. So we're talking a lot about how you're taking a lot of the elements from the consumer audio applications and bringing them to the commercial side of things. But there is also a lot of commercial side of things that they do very well. These large sound reinforcement systems and all that you also started bringing towards consumer products. Is there like specifics there that you can kind of talk about that the commercial side was doing really well that you started bringing more to the hi-fi systems?
Yeah, I mean, primarily the only performance advantage that professional systems had at the time, and probably still true today, is really dynamic range and the ability to play loud. They don't do it with much refinement or finesse, but they do it. And you turn a consumer speaker up loud to try to reproduce a action adventure movie or something like, God forbid, a Michael Bay movie or something. And they fall apart. They break. They either can't do it or they fail altogether. And so that's really all I've done is I've taken transducer sort of thinking from commercial and speaker voicing and what makes a good sounding, accurate hi-fi speaker. And I've tried to pull everything from sort of both market segments together in a harmonious way without pulling in any of the stuff that's bad, right? So there's, I think I touched on just in my last answer that, there is a lot of thinking in audio that is misinformed or perhaps incorrect or something. So there's a lot of dogma. And I think one of the notes that I made for you guys is it really shocks me. And I don't know why others haven't been surprised by this too, but I'm holding up my iPhone here. It's essentially a supercomputer that now fits in my pocket. The world the technology has advanced. It's crazy how technology is advanced in all the other product categories except for audio. And the company that makes the Theory transducers, all of the Theory components are built by a company that just celebrated its 100th year anniversary, right? So they're the longest contiguously running loudspeaker manufacturer, and the speakers they were making 100 years ago and the ones that make today are just not that different, right? They're largely very similar. The materials have advanced. There's some advancements, but fundamentally it's a diaphragm of some sort, paper, with a coil of wire and a permanent magnet, and that's what it is. And so audio, because I think acoustics and audio is hugely complicated, right? If you wanted to categorize how fast a car is, right, in a straight line, you could say, okay, how fast is your car in a straight line? It's like, I don't know, let's measure the 0 to 60 mile an hour time and find out, right? And so you floor the throttle and you figure out how long it takes you to go to 60 miles an hour, and you've got your answer. And you say, okay, if somebody asks the questions, how fast is your car? You can say it goes from 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds, whatever the answer is. an analogy on the audio side, something as simple as SPL. You say, what is the max SPL of your audio system? And you have probably a dozen variables in the answer. It's like, okay, with what frequency rating, what spectral weighting, A, B, C, Z, with what content? What's the test signal? Is it noise? Is it music or soundtrack content? Is it a sine wave? If it's noise or content, what's the crest factor of that noise, right? And then what meter, what time averaging are you using? Are you using a fast setting, a slow setting? Are you doing peak? Like what? You could get 25 different answers to the same question. You ask the question about the car, you get one answer, the real answer. You ask a question in audio and you've got 25 different answers and nobody knows which one's the right one, right? So that has led to all of this sort of spaghetti of misinformation and misunderstanding and confusion in the audio world, unfortunately.
And with that kind of analogy, is there a couple things that you can point to in your opinion that essentially matter to people that they don't think matter, or inversely things that they think matter that in reality don't matter very much?
Yeah. So, in audio, that sort of uncertainty and complexity that we live with on a day-to-day basis, it does lead a lot of people to start to worry about stuff that ultimately doesn't matter. And it also causes some folks to overlook stuff that does. And so what you end up with is, the confusion, I think, happens. And I like the way Floyd addresses this in his book. By the way, anybody, I'm going to plug his book. His book is fantastic. So if you don't have it, go immediately after this and go buy it. But he talks about, we largely started to have problems with speakers or audio systems inside of rooms when we started to measure them in rooms, right? And so where I was going with that is, you can put a microphone in front of an audio system and you're always going to get a curve, and it's probably going to look awful, right? Like it's not going to look appealing. And so your eyes go, oh my God, that's terrible. We need to fix that, right? And that's the problem, is people started to try to fix stuff that you're not supposed to fix because their eyes told them to fix it, not their ears, right? And so I have this phrase where I say, quit listening with your eyes. There's a couple of occasions when listening with your eyes works and it's valuable. And we can, if we have time, we can talk about those. But for the most part, what happened is like phase is something you can measure, right? So if you can measure it, it must matter. And if an audio system, isn't linear phase, then it can't possibly be as good as one that is. But that's one of the problems that's when you worry about the wrong thing. Yes. Audio system isn't typically linear phase. Almost none of them are. It's very hard. And even if you could get one to be it would only be in one point in space. And that, I don't know who you're serving when you do that. But it doesn't matter because human beings don't really listen to or care about phase. Like we just don't care about it. You can shift the phase and we don't hear it and we don't care about it, right? Another example of something you can measure that people react to and try to address is comb filters, right? So if you see a comb filter in a measurement, those are those repetitive, really deep cancellations, right? And it looks like, oh my God, whatever is causing that comb filter, we have to fix it. The problem is human beings don't care about comb filters, right? If we did, none of our discussions in real life would be possible, because if you're sitting in a conference room with a bunch of people around a table, you're hearing all kinds of comb filters. So if I'm sitting across from you, Jorden, at a conference table and I'm talking to you, the first thing you hear is the sound directly from my mouth to your ears. But then there's a sound that bounces off the table and arrives at your ears. And then there's sound that bounces off the wall behind me and arrives at your ears and the ceiling, and then your ears and the side walls. And all of those delayed signals are coming in, creating massive complexity and a ton of comb filters in there. But what happens? You don't care. You listen to me talking and you hear me just fine, right? I think Floyd uses the analogy of, concert halls. are just massive comb filter generators, right? That's how they work. A well-designed concert hall has surfaces that get the sound of the orchestra or the performance to the listener's ears via reflected energy. And so all of those reflections are all interfering with each other, causing millions of comb filters. And we don't care. We listen to the orchestra, right? So this is a segue into a topic I'm super passionate about, and we probably don't have time for me to pontificate too long on it. But this notion of room correction, or somehow adjusting the audio system to adapt it to the room that it's in, is one of my pet peeves, and it's one of the things that I think the industry has unwittingly sent the message to the consumer that, number one, if your audio system's in a room, then you need to EQ it for the room. And number two, if you do that, it will somehow fix things, right? Room correction, right? Like that terminology in and of itself makes me angry, because you're not correcting anything, least of all the room, right? So let's just agree on a few things. Number one, if you adjust your hi-fi, the room is not changing, right? So, these schemes are EQ. They're all they're doing is they're adjusting the spectral content of what comes out of the speakers in the system, right? The room is not changing. The room acoustic is not changing. All the reflections are happening. And I think that there's this perception that you can somehow adjust the knobs on your hi-fi system and change your room acoustic. And it's not true. It doesn't happen, and it doesn't even work. And you shouldn't do that. This is a complex topic. It would be a whole hour or two on its own.
We'll have you back for this one. I love this.
I can go on and on about this, but there's just so many sources of error in those concepts and in that thinking. And the thing I think that's the most detrimental is this idea that changing the audio system somehow improves your room acoustic, because what invariably happens is, if you have a good audio system, so if your speakers are really well engineered and adhere to the research that Floyd and his colleagues did, we could just say the CEA 2034 data, right? We know that information captured by CEA 2034, sort of the let's just simplify it by saying the on-axis response and the off-axis behavior of the speaker. If you have a really good one, and then you put it in a room and do a bunch of changes to that really good speaker, you're by definition making the speaker less good, right? And by the exact amount of those changes. So said another way, the problem with those schemes is nearly all of them. I don't know of one that doesn't do this, but what it does is it uses the measured sound field that includes all the reverberant energy in the room plus the direct sound, and it endeavors to somehow improve that based on that measurement that includes all the reverberant sound. The problem with that is it does so at the expense of the direct sound, right? And as human beings, we've evolved to prioritize the direct sound. So the sound that comes straight from the speaker to your ears, or straight from your mouth to my ears when you're speaking. If we were in that same conference room, just common sense wise, if we're sitting in a conference room and I'm talking to you, there's all these reflections. So your brain receives the sound directly from my mouth, and then it receives dozens of copies of the same sound, right? So it's coming off the table and it's coming off the walls, and you get all these copies. If your brain didn't discern and prioritize the first arriving sound, then it would just be completely confused, because it would get 24 of the same sounds coming from different directions. And so we focus in on the direct sound. We hear the reverberant sound, but we don't listen to it. Does that make sense? Let me say that again. We hear the reverberant sound, but we don't listen to it. We listen to the direct sound.
So I think what I'm getting from this is this idea that, the intention in a lot of this stuff is to get technical perfection at the expense of what is largely considered pleasurable audio. And I say largely considered, like all the research seems to show that generally speaking, people like certain things, direct on axis, flatness, or kind of
flat, accurate on axis response.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah. So think about it. If you take a speaker with really flat on axis response, which all of ours are, and you put it in a room, and then you measure the sound, including all the reverberant energy, and then you apply EQ, you've now just moved our direct sound from being accurate away from being accurate, the exact amount of the EQ you're applying, right? So our speakers anechoically measure ruler flat. If you put a +3 Q of 1 at 500 and then a -6 Q of 3 at 2.2 K, you've now just made our on-axis measure, our on-axis performance that your ear cares about the most, inaccurate by +3 and -6, right? Which is crazy error, right? In the response. Can you imagine if somebody built a power amplifier and they said, oh, we're +3 at 500 and we're -6 at 2K, but other than that, it's a good amp. Nobody would ever remotely consider that, right? But in speakers, it's like, oh yeah, it's fine. Just do what you want. Fix it in post. That doesn't happen. And it's, again, this is a long, complex topic, but kind of a way to summarize it would be that we know that human beings care most about the direct sound. That's what we listen to. We hear this other stuff, we hear the reflections, but we listen to the direct sound. And all of those schemes, so-called room correction schemes, sacrifice the direct sound in favor of the reverberant sound, which we don't listen to. That's sort of a succinct way to say it. And then compounding that is, they do it, they kind of sell this notion of hitting some sort of target that is supposed to be the right reverberant target. And that's BS too, because there's no way anyone is going to know what the right target is, because it's the right target is impacted by the loudspeaker directivity and the room acoustics, right? And so the automated systems, sorry, I know I'm going to offend the manufacturers of these automated systems, but the automated systems don't have any knowledge of speaker directivity or the room acoustic properties. And so there's no way, it's impossible for them to know what the target should be. And we can rule out flat, because we know that a flat reverberant response is awful sounding. Anybody who's heard that knows that that's not right. So the target's non-flat. Nobody can say what it's really should be. And so they sacrifice the most important part of the speaker performance in an effort to achieve some fictitious reverberant target that doesn't exist.
Okay. So I know that we can talk about this for another hour easily, 2, 3, keep on going. What I'm going to do, we're going to start kind of closing this down for this episode, and we're going to have you back in the future. Okay. I guarantee that, as long as you're up for it.
Sure.
What I'm going to ask now is kind of a final question I ask for different folks that come on. You probably already heard this question on some of the other podcasts, but for you, I'm going to kind of stipulate it that your answer can't be Tool.
Yeah.
So if you were to tell people, hey, this is a soundtrack to my life. This is what I would listen to if I was stuck on a desert island, or if I drove you in a car for a couple hours, or this is what you just listen to unwind. What would that be for you without being Tool? Because I know how much you love Tool.
Yeah. So it won't be only Tool, but so I I've listened to your podcast, so I know that this kind of question comes at the end. So I thought about this. I was like, what would I do? So what I kind of landed on was that it would have to be a playlist. And that playlist would have a whole bunch from the Radiohead catalog.
Nice.
And it would have Tool. So Radiohead for my, say I'm trapped on a deserted island during the day, I'm milling about, I'm foraging for food, whatever. I'm going to listen to Radiohead. When I want to sort of amp up my testosterone, I'm going to listen to Tool. And then at night when I'm winding down, I'm going to have some Eric Satie in there. And have to put on my best French accent, but the Gymnopédie and the Naciens, the slow Eric Satie compositions. So that would be, I could probably live on a deserted island with just those three artists.
And then just because we spoke about this and you sold your drum set on your dad's advice to get the speaker stuff started, you still play drums. You bought a couple drum sets at this point.
I did. I noodle around here and there when I have time. I'm busy. Starting the second business was completely underestimated. I was like, it's going to be easy. And boy, did I get that wrong. But yeah, no, I do. I sit down at the drums every once in a while, and I do have affection for drummers, including Danny Carey from Tool. If you don't know Tool's music, buy the most recent album, Fear Inoculum, put on Invincible, put your headphones on, and then just realize that that's just one drummer playing, and then have your head explode because he's playing in 4 different time signatures at the same time. So I do have still an affection for drums. I wish I can play them better than I can, though. So.
I think your dad would be proud at this point because it all worked out. You got the drum set and the speakers.
That's true. I got them both now, so that's good. Yeah.
Paul, I greatly appreciate you coming on. I think we're going to have you back in the future because I think there is a lot to unpack about EQ and some other stuff we didn't get a chance to talk about. But thank you for coming on. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and your time.
Yeah, no, it was great. Thanks for having me.